Good evening, friends. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's discussion on the facts and fiction of critical race theory. My name is Jackson Meredith, representing the Black Cat House here in Lincoln, Nebraska. We are a social justice organization dealing with a wide range of social justice issues since June of 2013. Our mission statement is to educate ourselves and anyone else in the community who'd care to join us about oppressive power structures and how to dismantle them. And as we've kind of had to cope with limited in-person opportunities over this continuing COVID pandemic, we've tried to experiment more and more with online events like this one. If you like tonight's event, I would encourage you to look for our YouTube channel, where you can see some of the previous forums we've done over the last couple of years. We've got some pretty cool stuff there. Most recently, we had our second installment of Black Musicians in Liberation with Professor Kwame Dawes of the UNL English Department. He was talking about the enduring social legacy of the music of Bob Marley. If you missed it, trust me, you missed it. Go back to YouTube and check it out. As far as the event tonight goes, so critical race theory. That's a three-word phrase that many of us had never heard before the last couple of years, especially those of us outside of the academy. But this tradition, once publicly obscure, has exploded across headlines over the last couple of years because of a coordinated backlash coming particularly from the Republican Party and their allies. Jim Pillen has ensured that this national issue has made headlines here in Nebraska as well. Pillen has been a known candidate to be our next governor for the last couple of years, and has primarily campaigned for the governor's mansion from his current office as a regent for the University of Nebraska by fighting against the so-called imposition of critical race theory in curriculum at the university. I'm sure you have questions. I know I do. So what is critical race theory, and why are the conservatives so upset about it? So let's get some answers. Our special guest tonight, hailing from the city of Chicago, Dr. Marvin Lynn is a lifelong educator who has worked in the field of education for nearly 3 decades. He began his education career in the early 1990s as an elementary teacher in the New York City public schools and the Chicago public schools. He is currently a professor of education at Portland State University in Oregon for a little while longer, and is a nationally recognized scholar, leader, and artist. As a researcher, he has conducted research on race, education, the work and lives of Black male educators, and best practices for advancing teacher diversity in the United States. He is considered one of the most highly cited researchers in the nation. He is particularly well regarded for his contributions to the field of critical race theory in education. He has been quoted or featured in interviews with several major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, BBC News, Fox News, and others. Dr. Lynn is the lead editor of the Handbook for Critical Race Theory in Education, which features the chapters by the most prolific scholars in the fields of education and the law. This is the first edition. It's now in its second edition, and it was recently published with Routledge Press. His research has been recognized by the American Educational Research Association, the Critical Race Studies in Education Association, and the University of the Free State in South Africa. Dr. Lynn is also highly regarded as an equity-minded leader who has taken on important leadership roles in a variety of settings. For the last decade, he has worked as a dean and associate dean at public universities in the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. He is also a national leader who serves as a member of the board of directors for the Carnegie Project for the Education Doctorate and the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. In Oregon, he serves as a member of the Oregon Community Ministry Board, which oversees Providence Hospitals in Oregon and Southwestern Washington, where he co-chairs the Equity Subcommittee that recently led an initiative to adopt an equity statement and framework to guide the hospital's efforts to address long-standing community health inequities. Dr. Lynn also serves on important governor-appointed committees, including the Education Advancement Council and the Educational Subcommittee of the state's Racial Justice Council. He also finds time to give back to his local community. As a resident and parent of students in the local school district in Tigard, Oregon, I don't know if I said that right, he serves as an elected member of the Tigard Tualatin School Board. Dr. Lynn is also an accomplished singer, performing in a variety of genres, including classical and gospel. He has performed with the Oregon Symphony Orchestra, Annapolis Opera Company, the Soul Children of Chicago, Reverend Clay Evans, and the Fellowship Baptist Church, and others. He is the founder of the South Shore Opera Company of Chicago, where he has also performed regularly. And if you didn't see our first Black Musicians in Liberation panel last year, it's worth checking that video out just to hear Professor Lynn sing the song by his namesake Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. Stole the show. Dr. Lynn received a Bachelor of Science degree in elementary education from DePaul University in Chicago, holds a Master of Arts in Curriculum and Teaching from Teachers College Columbia University, and a PhD in Race and Ethnic Studies in Education from UCLA. And before we get started, let me also share the announcement that he has recently been named the next Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Colorado, Denver. It is my honor and privilege to welcome Professor and soon-to-be Dean Marvin Lynn. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. It's great to be here. I'm hearing the echo. But thank you so much for that great introduction.
We are very excited to have you here tonight. Well, let's go ahead and get started right into the questions because we do have so many of them. So, to my understanding, critical race theory, or CRT, is a decades-old academic tradition that has remained largely unknown outside of the university, particularly grad schools, until now. I have heard CRT proponents argue that it's an intellectually sound framework for understanding racial inequities. Meanwhile, a political backlash has emerged from the conservative right condemning what they are calling critical race theory as this nefarious propaganda by activist professors to make white kids hate their ancestors and their government. So, first of all, are the two sides even talking about the same thing, or are we talking about two completely different things?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are talking about two completely different things, and I think we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit later about the machinations, right, that I think those on the conservative right are sort of going through as an exercise, as a political exercise, really, as a way to draw in more voters. So this is ultimately a political strategy to win votes. And so what's being described out there in the media is not at all critical race theory. It's a wide variety of things that fit under many different umbrellas, right? And that are all sort of thrown together and given the label critical race theory for political reasons. And I'll talk more about that later. Go ahead.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, let's start with what critical race theory really is. Could you please introduce us to the intellectual history of critical race theory? When is CRT first developed? Who are the major theorists? And what are some of the central ideas of critical race theory?
So, critical race theory is a form of scholarship. It comes out of the academy, right? So the anybody who's familiar with the academy, and I know you are, we are situated within fields, fields of sociology, fields of law, fields of education, and so on. And out of those disciplines come sort of very focused conversations about specific types of issues that I think come out of a need for certain groups within that field to be heard. And so in the 70s and 80s, Derek Bell was a law professor at Harvard University who was talking about race and racism in his classes in ways that actually captivated the interest and the imagination of students like Kimberly Crenshaw, right? And so as he began to do that, what happened is an insurgent form of scholarship began to emerge out of this work, and other people in the law were having the same type of experiences in terms of their teaching, in terms of their scholarship, and really raising questions about the role of the law in promoting racism, right? And raising questions about the inability of the law to really protect people of color in the United States, right? And there are all these examples. And see, legal scholars, they craft their arguments based on evidence and based on case law and historical documentation. And so what we began to see emerging out of Derek Bell's work and Richard Elgato's work was this sort of consistent and persistent kind of questioning of things like meritocracy, things like neutrality, objectivity, as it relates to the law. And they began to raise questions about whether the law, in fact, was designed to support and uphold democracy, freedom, justice, especially as it pertained to Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in this country. And so it really came out of a need for legal scholars of color to better understand how race and racial power were embedded in these laws in the US. As a result of Derek Bell's work, folks like Kimberly Crenshaw began to craft a movement, so to speak. And these scholars of color, by this time, there were at least 24 to 30 of them across the nation who are writing in this very sort of specific tradition of questioning race and racism in the law. They didn't have a name for it. They came together in the 80s and 90s to decide what to call this area of study. And they decided to call it critical race theory. And it was, again, situated within the legal field. And so critical race theory is really a theoretical and methodological approach that legal scholars are using to really examine the persistence of racism in the law, but also in the broader society. It offers a really strong critique of the law by asking that question, as I raised before, about why it seems to be the case that the law serves mainly the interests of white people. And so several principles are common across much of the work of critical race theorists who are situated in the law. One of them I already talked about is this idea that the law is not objective or neutral. In fact, it is rooted in a sort of racist history, as everything is. And that racism itself is a system of practices, right? And it's normalized, it's endemic to the society, that it is not something that is something that just happens between individuals, right? We typically understand racism to be, Bull Connor saying segregation today and forever, right? And that's racism to most people. And what critical race theorists are saying is, no, racism, you don't, oftentimes you don't even see it, right? It's just how we do business, it's how we function. And it's so normalized and it's so part of the system that we don't question it, right? They have a couple of other things that I think are common threads through their work, that they also argue that this system of racist practices creates a set of legal, economic, political, and social consequences that are advantageous for white people, but unfortunately disadvantageous for people who are not white. And so you can look at our society. I think Gloria Ladson Billings called it, it's like a racialized social system, I think is what Edward Billings calls it. And you can look at specific types of outcomes, be they in education, in the criminal justice system, in medicine, like you mentioned the hospital board that I serve on, and everywhere you look, right? Outcomes for folks of color are different than they are for whites, right? If you look at income and wealth, right? You see huge differences, vast differences in terms of wealth attainment for white people than you do for folks of color. And critical race theorists would argue that this was by design, and it is because of the way our society was structured on the basis of slavery, the exclusion and annihilation of indigenous people, and the conquest of Latinx people, and the exclusion also of Asian American folks. And so these sort of systems of practices have created a system that unfortunately disadvantages white people in this country in just about every way that we can imagine. And so what critical race theorists do is they observe and they document these instances, these practices, and the outcomes that are related to the practices, right? And they use evidence as a way to talk about inequalities in a variety of settings, but mostly in the law. And they also use counter storytelling methods as a way to share the stories from the standpoint of the victim. And so the racial narratives that I tell about my experience as a Black professor or a Black dean working in a white university setting would be considered a counter story because it runs counter to what we call the majoritarian story, which is a narrative about upholding whiteness, right? And so that counter story is a central methodological tool that critical race theorists use in their work.
I want to jump in, Jackson. Now, my name's Lori Dance. I'm an associate professor of sociology and ethnic studies. I am co-moderating, but Jackson is taking the lead on this. And I want to jump in with this question, Marvin, related to what you were just talking about, and that is how scholars have looked, and based upon evidence, they're looking at inequities that related to race. So, of course, scholars have also found inequities related to gender. Um, but why is it that, and of course, we can also see pushbacks against gender equality, but what's your opinion about why the political powers that be are going after critical race theory in a way that they would not go after critical gender theory? So in a way that it's that folk of color are particularly vulnerable to these types of historical critiques.
Well, I don't necessarily agree that they're not going after gender. I think they are. If you
Oh,
look
oh
at
yeah, yeah.
Trump's executive order, it says you can't talk about race or gender, right? But I think the conversation, the response around that has been muted. I feel like I'm not hearing enough conversation about the way in which these folks are also attacking critiques of patriarchy, right? And it's just not, there's not, to me, a big enough discussion about that. But I think you're right in the sense that race is an easy target, and historically has been used, right, strategically by folks on the right and sometimes on the left. I mean, there's people talk about Clinton's discussion of what they talking about super predators, right? Uh, so the political parties use and there's all kinds of research on this. If you know, I had a great opportunity to study with Frank Gilliam at UCLA, who is now a dean at one of the universities in North Carolina. I think it's UNC Greensboro. He's a president. I'm sorry, and his work was just about how race sort of shows up in political movements, right? Particularly races, elections, right? And so we can document historically how race has been used as a mechanism to scare people into voting for or against their own interests at different times in the country. Remember Willie Horton, the welfare queen. All of these images are racialized images to get us to be frightened of something enough that we vote for the person who is trying to scare us. And this is the same thing. Critical race theory is being used as a device, right, to get people to go out to the polls and vote against their fears, right? And I think the conservative right hopes that means it's a vote for them, and that they can get their people back into office. So this has been done over and over and over again. Critical race theory is a new sort of sexy, exotic term that people aren't familiar with. See, that's also important too, right? You find something that people aren't familiar with. You have the term critical in it, right? Which most people view, oh, that means we're attacking or tearing down, and that's bad, right? And then you have the term race, which in the U.S., we are for the most part racially illiterate. You and I aren't because we study this stuff, but the average person in the U.S. doesn't know how to talk about race and avoids conversation about race. And so when you bring race into the conversation, people are leery. And I can tell you, it's not just folks on one side of the political spectrum, it's folks on all sides of that spectrum. And so they're counting on that fear of race, the fear of talking about, approaching, or dealing with race as also part of that, right? And then you add the word theory. Well, you know what they think about intellectuals, right? Like us in these highfalutin universities that people might consider to be disconnected from reality and only focused on things that are abstract and not related to the real world. So it brings about a reaction in people who have no idea what it is, just because it sounds like something they shouldn't like. And so Christopher Rufo, who has been able to very strategically use critical race theory as an umbrella term to refer to all the things that he doesn't like, that are mostly progressive educational terms and ideas. It's a whole wide range of them.
I do want to come back to Chris Rufo and the activism around him here in just a little bit here, but I want to ask you one more kind of academic question about what critical race theory actually is before we start moving into some of this misinformation. And you kind of touched on this in your introduction, which I know Professor Lynn has to cover a lot of ground very quickly. We do have the chat open if people have any other specific questions about anything he's talking about. We'll try to follow up on some of those things here in a little bit too. But my understanding is that critical race theory originated with legal scholars, and it's still primarily being used in law schools. Yet you specialize in using CRT in education. So what is the value of critical race theory to other disciplines? And how do you or other education scholars adapt CRT for use in education?
Right. So, education, like all other disciplines, and people don't often think of education as a hardcore academic discipline, but it is, right? Just like sociology, I'll use, or anthropology, it is a field of study that people get doctorates in, and they pursue certain questions that are related to the field of education, right?
And you're currently at the Educational Research Association meeting, which usually has about 20,000 participants.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm in San Diego at the moment at the American Educational Research Association meeting, which is the sort of the largest, most prestigious international educational research organization in the world, right? And so yeah, I'm right at this nexus of all of that at this very moment. But I was hoping you to sort of understand this where education as a field is situated within academia and its relationship to other fields, because education scholars, like legal scholars, were frustrated, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous education scholars were frustrated about the way the field itself was limited in terms of its understanding of the conditions facing kids of color in schools, but also other communities of color in different ways, different subfields. There was limited understanding. I had an experience, just to give you one example of this. When I was in graduate school at UCLA, this was in the mid to late 90s, and this was around the time that critical race theory was emerging in the field of education. I remember going into a graduate classroom of a very well-known critical pedagogy scholar. And critical pedagogy comes out of kind of a neo-Marxist movement toward thinking about how we revamp education to be much more focused on the lives of the oppressed. And so I was interested in learning more and learning from this scholar who was very prolific and written a lot of books and was very well known. I agree with a lot of the criticisms that people like Paulo Freire and others had around the capitalist education project and how it just separates and divides people based on differences that they can't control. and so on. But that person wrote a book on their work, which mainly talked about and articulated kind of what they did as a classroom teacher when they were teaching in the K-12 context, and how that stuff related to what they were doing in higher education. And the early chapters of that book were sort of trying to provide different explanations for inequality in schools. And one of the chapters focused on Black kids and why Black kids were not succeeding in school. And the explanation that this really well-known, very knowledgeable, brilliant, critical pedagogue offered was that was based on the work of John Ogbu, the late Nigerian anthropologist who comes out of the University of California, Berkeley, who argued essentially that Black and Latinx culture is oppositional to the culture of school, and that explains why Black kids are not successful. And there I am, sitting after having taught many years and gone to grad school at Columbia and all this, like, what? And the thing that I said in class was, there's a poverty of theory around Black education. Like we don't understand what's happening with Black kids, and there's no theory to really help us explain that, right? That was my personal experience, but that experience, I think, was also being had by many, many, many others, including Bill Tate and Gloria Ladson-Billings, who started writing about critical race theory in the early mid-90s. Bill Tate wrote a piece in 1993 where he used critical race theory as a lens to look at his own exclusion and marginalization in the field of mathematics education, right? He's a math educator, and the conversation in the field of math education was sort of moving forward about what works, what doesn't, and Black math educators were not part of the conversation. So he was using CRT, which emphasizes issues of voice, right, and so on, particularly for people of color, as a frame to do that. And then a year or two later, Bill Tate and Gloria Ladson-Billings came out with this seminal piece called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. It was published at Teachers College Record in 1995, where they basically were introducing to the entire field, to great acclaim, I should say, this concept of critical race theory and how it might help us to see things in our field different. How it might take a different approach to looking at the issue of achievement and educational attainment for Black and Brown and Indigenous kids, that it might sort of be much more situated on things like slavery and segregation and the exclusion of folks. Which they're talking about things like the 200 or so years that Blacks were forbidden from reading, right? and that you have to contextualize these experiences, right, within the history of race and racism if you're going to better understand what's going on now. So that was the start of it, Jackson, right, with Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate. And it just took off from there. So my mentor at UCLA, Dr. Daniel Solorzano, was doing work around that same time using critical race theory as a lens to understand the perspective of students of color in higher education classrooms. And he was talking about microaggressions and the different ways in which we were being excluded from higher ed. Another individual, Larry Parker, was at the University of Illinois, and he was beginning other types of conversations about educational policy and how critical race theory could be used as a lens to help us understand that. So Bill Tate, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Larry Parker, Daniel Solorzano, and they were in different parts of the country, all were doing this work as scholars, but then they were also mentoring people like myself, right, who were learning what this theory was all about and how we could advance it and use it. And so you have a whole nother generation of people like myself, Adrian Dixon, David Stovall, Tandika Chapman, Jamel Donner, and others who are now, doing this work at a fairly high level too, and are taking on different ways to look at it. So my work, for example, looks at the experiences of Black male teachers, but it also looks at classroom practice, right? And so I talk about how we use critical race theory as a lens to understand pedagogy, and how we understand the perspectives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous teachers, and that they bring to that, right? And how we could advance a much more liberatory framework for teaching Black children. So, and the handbook of critical race theory in education is designed to be kind of like I would say a tour de force. Yeah, that's the first edition. Thank you. Kind of collection, right, of all the best scholarship in the field of education. And there's a couple of legal scholars in there too. Richard Delgado's in that book. A scholar from the University of Indiana is in that book. Indiana University is in that book. Legal scholar. And then we also have a sociologist, but they're primarily education scholars. And Gloria Ladson-Billings, all of our mentors are there, basically saying this is the best of the best in the field of critical race theory and education. That helps us take another look at, what's happening with schools, and is it just about culture, or is it about something bigger than that? And I think we would argue there's about something bigger than that. That race plays a fundamental role in shaping the experiences of kids in school, but also the outcomes. Probably a way too long of an answer there, but you asked.
No, that was wonderful. Of course, I think it's I think it probably has to be on the mind of many people, especially given the history of critical race theory as a relatively narrow legal theory. I think it's really interesting to hear how you, even on an academic level, are applying it to a completely different discipline for great results. I think that's something that people can try to emulate and try to find other ways to apply the relevant parts of this theory to other
Jackson.
areas.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the recognition of that. It is also no accident that my mentor, who was at UCLA, was basically at the same institution as Kimberly Crenshaw and Cheryl Harris and other people, right, who were at the vanguard of the movement in the law. You had education scholars working at those same institutions. It's no accident that Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate were at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that University of Wisconsin-Madison is the place where these legal scholars got together on an annual basis to have these conversations, right? So this is also about relationships that scholars have across disciplines, and when you have brilliant scholars like the ones that I'm talking about. Bill Tate is now the president of Louisiana State University, and Gloria Ladson-Billings recently retired, but still very active. In fact, she was here today at AERA. But they have these relationships across disciplines, and that also influences, I think, how they're thinking about this field, and then how they are teaching and training the next generation, which I was fortunate to be part of.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, before we move on here in a moment, I just want to also kind of echo something that Dance said a few minutes ago. Just really want to just express my appreciation and my respect for you coming and giving this talk tonight, especially when you're already at a major academic conference on all this stuff, and you're just taking time to just chat with us between sessions in your hotel room. Just really a lot of appreciation and respect for you taking the time tonight. You're obviously a very busy man.
Well, thank you for having me.
But I think now it's probably time to move on to this right-wing backlash that has pushed this into the news. Unfortunately, most of us are only talking about critical race theory now because of this large-scale backlash coming from the political right. CRT is being condemned by conservative media like Fox News, and Republican politicians across the country have made it a partisan issue. Here in Nebraska, University of Nebraska Regent and gubernatorial hopeful Jim Pillen has been campaigning for the governor's mansion from his current job by trying to ban the so-called imposition, his word, of critical race theory on NU students. Who is coordinating this political effort to vilify critical race theory, and what are they really trying to gain from the effort?
I want to show you really quickly a video that let's see. Yeah. And I'll just show you just a little bit of it. And there's several videos out here, but there are all these interesting tools that I think the right has used as a way to share with their electorate um, a kind of scary message about what CRT is, and have emboldened them to fight back, to take action with the school board, right? And they've given them a whole set of strategies and tools that they are to then use as a way to fight against this very scary, terrible thing, right, that they've built up in people's minds. And so this video is one example of that. Now, how do I share my screen, Jackson? Is it possible to do that?
Ty, can you help with that?
Yeah, if you look at the menu bar at the bottom, there's like a screen with an arrow in the middle of it.
Oh, okay. Yep, I see it.
But Ty, don't let me, because I don't know what I'm talking about. But I think that's how you do it.
I see it. I think I can find it. Let me see. All right. Open system. Okay. I got to open system preferences. But it's just one example, of a tool that's being used that people can access pretty easily. That is just really accessible, and they what the right is very good at is using language that people understand, right? And they make it plain, as my mother would say. We're not so good at that, and as a result, I think they are in many ways more successful in getting the average person to kind of take up their cause, so to speak. It's requiring me to do some stuff with my system and unlock some things and do all kinds of. So I'm not going to go through that trouble, but
would you possibly like to drop the link to that video in the chat for people to watch it on their own time?
I could do that, yeah. But with the video features Chris Rufo.
Yes, please talk about. I know you dropped Chris Rufo's name a few minutes ago. Tell us more about who he is.
Yeah, so he is I like to refer to him as a failed politician because he ran for office in the city of lost. And sometimes people lose things where they're not successful in something, and they take on a range of individuals. But so he started looking around.
Critical race theory is everywhere.
You want me to try to share it, Marvin?
Sure.
Okay, let me see if I can get it to. Right.
Critical race theory.
I guess if we don't all play it at the same time, right?
Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing either. We should let Ty try to share it.
All right. Yeah. I think this system, and our computers are right to say, well, we don't recognize this. Let's go through some extra steps to make sure that this is not, a virus or something taking over. And we just don't have the time right now to try to go through all the processes of clearing it and giving it the access that it needs to be able to share the screen. If I had thought about it, I would have done it earlier. But the video is Chris's kind of attack on CRT. Christopher Rufo, go to his Twitter page, and you also see where he basically is chronicling what he is defining as a very, very successful rebranding of CRT, right? So it was his effort to take this obscure term that nobody knew and rebrand it, right? And there he is. You want to show it now? Yeah, just show. I'll tell you when to cut it off. Go ahead. I can't hear it. You got to unmute.
Wow, that's like the multiverse.
Technology.
Yeah, I would say let's not go through this right now. I think people can look at it on their own time. Because by the time we figure it out, we'll have lost our audience. The 13 that are here, right? It's 12, 13. Um, but they've got the link, so they can go and watch it on their own time, just to get a sense of like the propaganda, right? And what the conservative right is very good at is creating these tools that people can sort of latch on to, that against scare them to the polls, right? And so this is a fear tactic. And what he's saying is that critical race theory is at the root of all of our problems in America, and that it has infiltrated all schools, and that your children are being forced to become critical race theorists, and that it is your responsibility to stop this now. So, and then he goes into a whole explanation about how people are that, and one of them is attacking school board members like me, uh, and voting for legislation that essentially cancels CRT from schools, and as well as higher education. And so we've seen across this nation, um, 36 different states have considered some kind of legislation that either bans the use of or the teaching of race and gender in the K-12 schools. Florida, of course, is saying, let's not talk about race, gender, or sexuality, right? So don't say gay. And then Texas is making it a crime to be transgender, in addition to excluding conversations around race from the K-12 curriculum, and actively firing educators, right, who are said reportedly using terms like racism and white supremacy in their teaching. Tech teachers in Tennessee and Florida and Texas have been fired, and these are sort of widely known about cases that have come to light as a result of not following these new laws. And Christopher Rufo, I would argue, is at the root of a lot of that. Um, One of the things that he did in the summer of 2020, and the summer of 2020 is critical because it was following what we had all been sort of having all these great conversations around race in America because of the murder of George Floyd that happened before our very eyes, right? And so that forced us into a whole set of conversations around the nature of racism in our society, and there were all kinds of activities and statements and commitments being expressed in lots of ways around looking at and examining racism. And so one of the things that Christopher Rufo did, with the support of folks like the Koch brothers and other heavily well-heeled folks, um, is put out a manifesto to Trump, who was president at the time, to say, you got to do something about this, you know. And he called on Trump to create an executive order banning the use of race in professional development and other publicly funded um, efforts. And that's exactly what Trump did. And then and then it was, of course, it was debunked or by the Biden administration, but the language in that um, has persisted, and it has been used across this nation as a basis for state laws that have been erected, basically arguing the same thing.
Thanks for that. My next question you've already sort of partially touched on, but I'm going to ask it anyway, so hopefully you'll talk a little bit more on this. But to what extent do you think the current attack on critical race theory is simply an attempt to deflect and diffuse the momentum for racial justice gained after George Floyd's murder and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter?
That's exactly what it is. It's meant to take the teeth out of the Black Lives Matter movement. Probably the most successful effort, right, to argue, I think, effectively that we needed systemic change in order to improve the lives of Black people. Um, I don't know that. I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, Lori, but the civil rights movement, of course, was very successful at getting laws passed, the Voting Rights Act and so on, that I think made a big difference. But it feels like to me that the Black Lives Matter brought this issue of human dignity to the forefront in ways that perhaps we saw in the 50s and 60s with the I am a man, you know, I am somebody kind of posters where Black people were saying, we are human, we should be treated like that. But I think that movement was so successful at bringing attention to that. And then I think when the George Floyd murder happened, that got elevated. And there was these deep investments in the Black Lives Matter movement, but also other movements to address and correct white supremacy and racism in our society. And so absolutely, it was to sort of halt that conversation. And so what you see happening now, and it's been very effective, is that instead of moving forward with a conversation about how we can address racism, how we can invest in having better understandings about this, people are apologizing, they're hiding, they're justifying what they're doing and why they're doing it, or they're not doing it at all. And that's the point. Absolutely. Tommy, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I wanted to add this, and I'm gonna invite Stellan to say something too, because he's a resistance studies specialist. But yeah, and in post civil rights, we also got African American Black Studies Department. We got Chicano Studies departments. There was institutional change. Likewise, even in tandem with and definitely after George Floyd and definitely in the wake of Black Lives Matter movements, there have been new departments at universities, you know, to like have diversity and inclusion officers. And so this institutional change is similar to what happened post the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And of course, post George Floyd, it was international. I mean, there was international movements and they were very visual. And I just want to ask Stellan if he wants to add anything to this pushback against resistance.
No, I basically agree. I also think there is there is a need for the right to deflect from any perspectives that puts the blame on the system. So I think it's not just what's important here is that there's attack not just on the mobilization from Black Lives Matter, but also that there needs to be something that says that the problem is not the system. And critical race theory is putting emphasis on systematic aspects of the race situation. So I think, yeah, I basically agree.
You know, and somebody was asking me recently about, well, what's the connection between like the attacks on CRT and the attacks on transgender and gay and lesbian and bisexual people, right? And as a Christian, now a progressive leftist Christian, all right, I see that all of this, that there's a kind of religious fundamentalism that's sort of driving all of this, right? And if you look at some of the arguments, because I just had a conversation about this with my church, because they were asking the same question: what does the church have to say about this? And I kind of did a little bit of a search on, well, what is the church saying about CRT? And one of the authors that looked was talking about CRT seen by the religious right as heretical, as highly problematic, because there's this deep emphasis on the individual and one's behavior, right? And personal responsibility. See, that whole trope of personal responsibility that comes out of this conservative discourse is really religious fundamentalism, right? That's sort of dressed up and made to look like it's not. And so any kind of focus on systems is a denial of individual responsibility, which is deeply emphasized in that movement. And so concordantly, I think questions, conversations around gender identity that are not in line with very traditional notions of how genders are constructed, and sexuality that is outside of the traditional sort of heterosexist kind of perspective, are also considered to be heretical and attacks on the family and those kinds of things. So all of this stuff really comes out of a deep-seated kind of Christian fundamentalism, which is not at all Christ-like, right?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, Professor Lynn, you have been giving many presentations, interviews, public talks about critical race theory, defending critical race theory since this political backlash started. What are the biggest misconceptions about CRT that you are frequently encountering, and how do you answer them?
Well, people think that CRT is a school curriculum, right? And I disabuse people of that notion pretty quickly by explaining the academic intellectual history of CRT. And people they're surprised, they're shocked that it's a sort of intellectual discourse that comes out of higher education, and that is studied by a select group of people, that they really oftentimes come to these conversations thinking that it's something that first graders are studying in school because that's what the writers told them, right? And most teachers have no idea what it is and how it's used. I also help them understand, though, that the efforts that teachers are making to try to address issues of culture and social class and gender and race and other, to try to create classroom environments that fit everybody's needs, right? That's been an ongoing project because of the persistent failure that we've had with underserved populations, right? People are trying to figure out, how do I do something that's going to work? And research has shown that connecting the curriculum to kids' culture and identity in positive and productive ways actually makes a difference in kids' learning, right? People misconstrue that as critical race theory, and I help them understand that has nothing to do with critical race theory, right? That's about people trying to understand who their kids are, and culture being an important domain of which to sort of focus and emphasize. But again, because the right has said culturally relevant teaching and multiculturalism, all that CRT, people get very, very confused. They have a whole set of terms that they have associated with CRT that have nothing to do with CRT. And so people are very confused. They come to our school board meeting saying, stop doing social emotional learning. That's CRT. Now we have to explain it. Let me tell you why that's not CRT. This is about trying to understand who kids are and help them overcome whatever emotional barriers they may have to learning, right? So that they can get to the business of learning. But to understand that learning is a social and emotional process. It is not merely an intellectual exercise divorced from the social and the emotional, that all these things are bound up and connected together. Because guess what? We're human, we're not machines. And so teachers are trying to better understand and tap into that. So people come with these misconceptions about the kinds of things that people are doing in school to help improve the academic success of particularly underrepresented kids, that's CRT, and I have to disabuse them of that. People come with the belief that CRT is about attacking white people. It certainly is about critiquing racism and white supremacy. And if you personally feel attacked when somebody critiques racism and white supremacy, then maybe for you that's what it means. But it certainly is not about saying that white people are the enemy, that they are bad, that they must be, whatever. That is not the discourse. This is about the construct of racism, and yes, and it implicates white people in that. White people certainly have an important role to play in the promotion and advancement of racism, and that's real. But it isn't focused on this sort of kind of emotional haranguing of people at on a very personal level and holding people personally responsible for doing something. It's more about looking at systems, but it doesn't alleviate white folks of their responsibility to look critically at those systems and to address them.
There's a
Thank you for that.
There's a question from Wyatt in the chat that says, just how far back does the embedding of racism into law go? Roman slave laws, Code of Hammurabi? Does CRT as an academic discipline mostly focus on the United States, or does the study have an international or world historical branch?
Interesting question. You know, it is very U.S. focused and situated, and it's critiqued for this, right? Critical race theory gets heavily critiqued for this. It really is kind of situated within the Black American experience in terms of the civil rights movement and the history of racism and discrimination that Black folks have experienced, because those are the people that, you know, Derek Bell was writing about the Black experience, and he's what people would call the father of CRT. But there were other scholars like Richard Delgado, Margaret Montoya, and others writing about the experience of racism in the Southwest. So those stories exist too. But that's, again, those are all very US-based stories. There are indigenous scholars also writing about issues of tribal sovereignty and the history of how treaties were ignored and how folks were excluded and annihilated and so on, and what that means about the Native experience in this country. And so it's multicultural in that sense. I mean, it gets critiqued as being kind of focused on Black people, but I think it's focused more broadly than that, but it definitely is centered within the US context. I mean, I've spent time in South Africa talking about CRT, and that very same question came up. And so what we began to do within South Africa is to say, yeah, we need to really look at how this applies in this context, because CRT is born out of American experiences with racism that don't necessarily fit as neatly within other contexts, and we recognize that. But I think there is this need for sort of broader understanding about the kind of international aspects of this. We certainly think about racism and white supremacy as a global system, right? And people sort of understand races in similar ways throughout the world. But how that functions and how that operates in different contexts is different, right? And so there's been a lot of research, for example, looking at race and racism in Brazil. And we see similar outcomes in terms of Black people, but the way it's understood, the way it's talked about, the racial system in Brazil is very different, right, than it is in the US. And so you have to take all those things into account. And then the sociologists have looked at those things. When I went to a conference a couple of years ago at UCLA, where there was a very intentional effort to bring together kind of traditional US-based critical race legal scholars with scholars who focus on international law, right? And a lot of these scholars were from the South Pacific and other areas who were trying to sort of integrate understanding about international law and how it has shaped the experiences of folks, for example, like on the Fuji Islands, right? And how that operates as a sort of white supremacist kind of construct to shape the particular political, economic experiences of those folks, but how that's different and contextually from what we experience in the US as Black Americans. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to explore this. And so I would encourage Wyatt to begin to take that up. And I know that the folks at UCLA are beginning to do that. So, you look out. They do a critical race theory conference every year. And there was an opportunity to connect around this.
Yes, and I want to add that we know when we had our Black Musicians in Liberation talk, and Anders Nergård was participating in it, that he's applying critical race theory in Sweden. So it is being picked up by other scholars. I just wanted to go to a couple of the things in the chat. So a fellow gister, who I believe is my cousin Fonda, says, Derek Bell is from Pittsburgh, where my father grew up. Derek Bell is from Pittsburgh. So that's just some additional information. Thanks, Fonda. And Stellan asks, what does critical race theory have to say regarding what strategies to use to undermine racism.
I think
and thank you, Stellan, because Marvin, I definitely wanted you to talk more about methods. Like critical race theory also has a methodological approach as well, but strategies to undermine racism.
Well, I was going to say, I think the main strategy is to expose it, right? And to use the counter storytelling method, which is sometimes fictionalized, right? If you read Derek Bell's work in the early 80s, he's a set of books, And We Are Not Saved was one of them. There were several, there's a series of them, gospel choirs, where there are these sometimes offering solutions. But I think the main goal has been to sort of expose it in various ways. One of the people, Lonnie Guinier, was not a critical race theorist per se, but Lonnie Guinier is a law professor who was thinking about voting and the political system and how we might develop a systems that were more inclusive of minoritized groups, right? And she was referred to by folks. I think she was the first Black woman, I think, who was actually potentially being considered for the Supreme Court, right? Back when Clinton was president, and was attacked by folks on the right as being a quota queen, because what she was arguing is that we needed a sort of representative democracy that included all people, regardless of their numbers in society, and came up with a solution for sort of equalizing minoritized communities with white communities and so on, and was attacked for that and subsequently not named to the Supreme Court. People,
and Clinton walked away from her too.
Sure did. He sure did. Yeah. Nobody talked about that during this latest successful bid of President Biden to appoint Ketanji Brown Jackson. But that was very important. So I look to her as a person who has tried to help us think about solutions, right, that have not been welcomed. But for the most part, I think it's about exposing racism and white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just want to remind folks, we do probably have time for one or two more questions, although the chat is currently empty. So I will go ahead and put to Professor Lynn here the last question I'd prepared tonight. Could this political campaign against critical race theory backfire? Is there an opportunity here to popularize CRT while it's in the headlines?
I do think that that's what's actually happening, especially among folks on the left. I do think this is a politically divisive issue. And I think if you are a very conservative person who doesn't want to talk about race, then your views are likely going to be hardened. I can tell you that I have had many, many more conversations with people like that and help them understand. Like, I've been on Fox News, I was even on Newsmax. I don't put that in my bio, but I was on Newsmax. And it was actually not a terrible conversation. I mean, I was shocked, right? Because what they were concerned about was how some educators were talking about issues of diversity and social justice in my community. So they called on me because I was close to that community to sort of explain this and talk about it. And I said, listen, that's one person's views. That's not a district policy. That's not a state policy. So please, let's not get alarmed about what one person has had to say about, why we have to pay attention to certain things. And this educator put it in terms that were not very kind. And so they capitalized on, they seized on that. But when I just clarified that, this is one person, and what we got to, in that conversation was, hey, if we're going to have conversations about how people's lives have been impacted by laws or policies or other types of historical events, as long as it's documented, that's okay. And this is what this newscaster said to me on Newsmax. And I thought, well, absolutely, that's what we do, right? When we tell stories about racism, that stuff is documented. It's based on legal historical fact. So we don't have an issue then, do we? He said, no, not at all. So I mean, so I don't know whether he was just, you know, playing a game with me or what, but it was on TV, and I felt if we can have these kinds of meeting of the minds around what it is we're trying to do, great. You know, I personally don't feel that it's a teacher's right to tell kids how to think, right? So I'm not going to stand in front of a kid and say, that's racist, that's sexist, that's homophobic. I don't think that's my job. My job is to say, here's what happened. What do you make of it, right? And let them decide. And I think a lot of conservatives agree with that kind of approach. I think that what they feel is happening is that people are telling their kids that not only is that thing over there racist, but they are also a racist, and making their kids feel bad. And that's not happening. And if that is happening, I don't agree with that at all, right? So I think maybe we're not as far apart as we think we are on some of this stuff. I think that unfortunately the right is ginning up a lot of fears and concerns in people who would otherwise be reasonable folks, and who would be willing to have a conversation. There was a recent poll on CBS that basically asked folks, you know, mostly white folks, what are their views on all this stuff? They said, how do you feel about CRT? Most of them said, we have a negative view on CRT, right? Especially conservatives. But when you ask conservative white people if they think books should be banned, they said, no, we don't think books should be banned from schools, right? And this was based in Virginia because of Youngkin and all the terrible things he's doing. And if you ask them, is it okay to teach about the history of race in America? The majority of them said, well, yes, right? With a certain amount of historical documentation. So people aren't necessarily opposed to the teaching of the civil rights movement and slavery and you know, the Trail of Tears and these kinds of things. They're opposed to this creation, this fictionalized thing that the right has created, and basically telling them that all these educators are attacking their kids and making their kids cry in classroom because they're white. And I would be opposed to that as well. I would never teach like that. And so I think, you know, there's an opportunity, Jackson, here for more dialogue and conversation about what we are doing, what's developmentally appropriate in the classroom, right? Both the higher education classroom and the K-12 classroom, and how we teach in ways that are accurate, that are respectful of every kid that comes into that space. Understanding that you can have conversations with college kids about issues of identity and politics in ways that you can't with second graders, right? And unfortunately, some educators may not understand that. And I think we gotta start talking about that, you know, rather than just banning it outright, to say, let's talk about how we do this in a way that's respectful of everybody. Because yeah, I would argue that racism and white supremacy is a problem, and that white folks benefit from that. But I don't think it gives me the right to beat up on and attack white people, right, at a personal level. Will I hold white people accountable? Absolutely, but in a professional, productive way. So I think a lot of this stuff is just fears that are being, you know, projected onto this by people who have something to gain, and that's votes, you know, for their party. And I think if we understand that, maybe we'll come out on the other end of it. I do think that these conversations that we're having are good and important. You know, you are recording this, so it's memorialized. It's out there for people to access and say, okay, if I really want to know what this, let me see if I can make sense of what this guy is talking about, right? And I'm a big fan of education, right? And unfortunately, we're doing it under conditions of I wouldn't say duress, maybe stress, because of what's happening legally across the country. But at the same time, I think the conversation that you, Jackson, and Tommy are putting forward and are making possible is important. And I think it contributes some good out of all of this. You know, are we gonna, you know, Gloria Ladson-Billings said today, her life hasn't personally been affected. You know, and I'm saying this because she is the progenitor of critical race theory in education, right? She brought this to the field of education. And I've, you know, jumped on the bandwagon as a grad student and now as a faculty member doing the same thing. And our lives haven't been personally affected necessarily by it. And so it's given us actually greater opportunity to have these conversations. Her work has increased in its visibility and its sales, and so has mine. So, I think it's given us more opportunity to share.
And I just wanted to also talk about the strategy for undermining racism, at least what I do in my class when I'm teaching about it to college students is I talk about its creation. I talk about it being a very narrow concept initially in the US, that you had to be Anglo to be white. So if you were German, Ben Franklin was calling you all kinds of names. Swedes at one point weren't considered white. We know about the Irish and we know about Italians, we know about Jews, but to show students that how this thing called whiteness came about and then became embedded in and it's there at the as early as 1790, right, with the Naturalization Act that only gave citizenship to property owning white men, didn't give it to white women, didn't give it to poor white people, certainly didn't give it to natives or in folks held against their will in captivity, black folk, right? But then and then I found that students are quiet. They didn't know that. They didn't know that thing was created and very quickly institutionalized and embedded, and they can follow that logic. And at one point, they probably had grandparents or great grandparents that weren't considered white. So that's actually one of my strategies in the classroom. And that's not what Chris Rufo is saying that that's what Chris Rufo is saying that I'm doing or we're doing. It's not at all what's being done. But I wanted to go to another question. We have a question. Does CRT need a rebranding to something like the history of race and law in America? How can meaning and name be reunited in students or the public minds? And that came from Wyatt. Thanks, Wyatt.
Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually coined the term critical race theory, professor at UCLA and Columbia, and she was there when I was a student at UCLA in the late 90s. She kind of responded to a question like that and said, no, we're not rebranding, renaming this thing because somebody has intentionally tried to rebrand it and make it something that it's not. We know what it is, and we'll keep using it and working with it, and we'll take every opportunity that we have to help people understand what it is not and why the rebranding effort is highly problematic and unethical. But we're not going to run from this term, from this concept, because of Chris Rufo or anybody else. They had better tell the truth, And I think our job is to sort of, keep telling the truth and showing up and being willing to have these conversations with you and others to make sure that people do understand what's really going on. Now, with that being said, would I advocate for a third grade teacher to show up in class tomorrow to say, here's a curriculum on the critical race theory of schools or of your neighborhood? No, I would not, right? Because I think there's so much misunderstanding and confusion about CRT, particularly at that level, that it would not probably be a useful exercise for that person. There are ways in which you can talk about Black, Brown, and Indigenous people's experiences, and that we have done in ethnic studies. Dominique can talk about that for days, right? That's what the field of ethnic studies has been all about, is the historicizing the experiences of folks of color. And you don't have to use the term critical race theory to have a critical conversation about race as it impacts these communities, right? So it is what it is. So I've heard terms like honest education, democratic education, right? That these are terms that the ENEA, the National Education Association, and the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, and other organizations are putting forward as sort of important ways to understand why we can't narrow the curriculum and exclude certain topics, right? And why we have to promote critical thinking, and we have to promote empathy, because like Lori was talking about, if people don't understand the historic role that their communities have played in advancing inequality, then it's hard for them to understand other people's position. And so, so as educators, I think we have an opportunity to talk about why critical thinking, empathy, and democratic education and honest education are all important. And you can have those conversations without using the word critical race theory, because it's not relevant to any of that stuff, to me anyway.
Thanks for that. Well, looks like our chat is clear, and we're kind of getting down to the last few minutes tonight. On behalf of the Black Cat House and our audience tonight, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, for coming and giving this talk, even when you're in the middle of a very busy conference. We love you, man. We love you, man.
No, thank you. Happy to do it. Again, it's about spreading the gospel as best we can, and sharing, the information, and hopefully correcting some of the misinformation that's out there.
Do you have a last word you'd like to leave us with tonight?
I would say that I did a Google search on critical race theory recently, and I sort of did it like this because I didn't know what I was going to see. And to my delight, Google, I think, gets it, right? That most of the hits are things that are speaking to what critical race theory actually is, right? And so somebody there understands the difference between sort of historical fact and propaganda. So things aren't as bad as you might think. I think that a lot of people are figuring out what's going on, and they're beginning to speak back to it, and they're beginning to take action. And I think that's one example, because Google structures the search functions in a particular way, and if they want you to find something, you'll find it. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that much of what's there is actually accurate stuff, and it's not, Chris Rufo and other people attacking CRT. And so you have to specifically look for that, and you can on YouTube and other places. But so I would say be optimistic and be courageous, though, because it's important to engage in the conversation. And I think people, particularly white people, have an important role to play in challenging some of this stuff and saying, no, that's not CRT. Don't do that. That's incorrect. And let me tell you why that's incorrect. Here's a link to a page. Here's a book. Here's something that will help you better understand. What you're really concerned about is this, right? I would say go to your school board meetings and support progressive educational policy and practice in your school districts, because school boards are under attack. And you have a bevy of conservative actors who are kind of strategically placed, right, by the party to show up at particular times and particular moments to attack, sometimes literally physically attack, but also certainly verbally attack school boards and superintendents. I think teachers are feeling threatened. Teachers are feeling like they can't teach. All of us have the power to write to our local school district, to our teachers, and say, we support you. We support an honest education. We think our kids should be learning about these things. If you need any support, let me know. So I think that support to your educators is important. I think that reaching out to leaders, city leaders, state leaders, is also important. I think there needs to be some organizing at the state, in all of our states, to ensure that we hold our legislators accountable for the policies that they put into place. That we need to make sure that those policies are representative of everyone and not just a small segment of people. And I think we need to hold folks accountable when they do things that are not. So there's a lot to do, and I appreciate you, Jackson and Lori, for bringing this conversation to the table. But I hope that it will inspire people to get moving, because we have work to do.
I'd like to thank you, Dr. Marvin Lynn, and I'm looking forward to the fact that you're going to be only about a 7-hour drive away from Lincoln when you move to Denver. I'll even brave bumping into a mountain lion to come out and see you.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, thanks again. It's been a wonderful evening. For those of you who had friends who weren't here tonight and needed to see this, again, this is being recorded tonight. This is going to be added to our YouTube channel here in the next few weeks when we're able to get that cleaned up and uploaded. Keep monitoring our channels, like our Facebook page and so on. You'll get notification when that's uploaded, and hopefully you'll come and watch it again. Tell your friends, tell them to come and watch it. In the meantime, if you need another dose of Dr. Marvin Lynn, once again, he was a guest on our first Black Musicians in Liberation last year. That's uploaded to our YouTube right now. You can go watch that. You can hear him sing. He's an amazing singer. But
Thank
for
you.
that, I think we'll probably call it a night here. Thanks, everybody. We might stay on and chat here informally for a few minutes, but I think we can probably kill the recording.
You don't go anywhere, Stellan, please.